Hello, everybody. Welcome to my weird, wonderful world. And I've had this idea for a video for a while. These are the types of videos I want to make more often on my channel. And and when I'm talking about music that is ahead of its time, I'm in this case I'm strictly speaking in general, like a wide understanding of what I feel, or even the consensus says is you know this is the album's artist or albums, artists, or groups in that is ahead of their time. Like I said, some of these are the consensus of what is agreed upon, and others in here is what I consider ahead of its time. Let's just start with the most obvious one, and that would be, of course, the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Club Hearts Band, Lonely Hearts Club Band. I always get that kind of backwards sometimes. But yes, this of course will be a consensus of saying this was ahead of its time. Nothing was like it before it, and this influenced so many people. Some people can throw in, you know, Rubber Soul and say that was ahead of its time too, but not like this. This is what people like when this came out. People were like they sat up and they took notice and say, okay, there's something really special and serious about this band that we need to pay attention. And they paved the way for so many others. You know, we have to give the Beatles a lot of credit, especially for this. I mean, of course, people can also say the White Album and that, but strictly speaking, this was the this was the pinnacle of their being ahead of the curve. Um, Now some of these are now, the ones that I don't have that some people might say would be like talking strictly about bands that were ahead of their time that I don't have in my collection would be something from maybe the Talking Heads or Radiohead or Joy Division, for example. Those, people, or even David Bowie stuff, because I only have Ziggy Stardust. But some people would argue that the second David Bowie album, which he considers the first David Bowie album, not considering that very, very first one, but that second one, the one he officially agrees that is the official one. That one people would say that's ahead of his time and I would sort of agree. Um, some people would say that this here Bob Dylan album was ahead of his time, that because it's transformative from what was before to what's after it. So do I kind of agree? I don't have the I heard this out of context. If I would have been into his career and heard things in that order, I probably would agree. But I've heard a few people mention this album as being ahead of its time, so okay, I I have to agree. Um, Maybe not necessarily this one, but the next one after it, or the next couple after it. But even this one, I would say was ahead of its time for Pink Floyd. Even like you can name almost anything, any album from Pink Floyd. Not every album, but there's a lot. Like Dark Side of the Moon, The Wall. They were considered. I would consider some of that, but mostly this one, their second album, which is right on the tip of my tongue with the name of it at the moment. I can't think of it, but that would be considered. I haven't heard that one, but considering what I heard of this one, yeah, I would say this would be ahead of its time. I've been hearing people talk about the next one being ahead of its time. Now this here is just this. I'm showing this album as a representative of all his works because you can name almost anything from this artist as being ahead of his time. But I'm using this as just the example, and I'm just showing Joe's Garage. But again, this is just an example. You could throw in Hot Rats. You can throw in, you know, Apostrophe, or any of the other top ones from Zappa. So I'm just again anything from Zappa is I would consider that ahead of its time. Um, how about this? King Crimson, Court of the Crimson King. This would be considered ahead of its time and blew people away. You know, yeah. Let's continue. I don't want to make this too long. Um, I would agree personally, and I know many of you may agree also that this was ahead of its time. This because they put all their feeling, all their anger, and with that whole side one being a complete song and story, and then yeah, this was ahead of its time. I would consider it so. Or how about the what most people consider the true origin of heavy metal or heavy rock? Would be this Black Sabbath here of the debut album ahead of its time. Nothing was like it before it, and nothing was like it after it. It paved again. It paved the way for an idea that you could have this type of sound, and be good. um, I had this in another order, but okay, I'll show this one here first because this is it's almost the same because there's a dark and broodiness and a certain angst behind this album that although a completely different genre, years later, this has the same kind of feel. This is a darker, more broody, affair that has its angst to it, and you know like the debut album, but in completely different musical style, but the same ahead of its time energy that some of those other stuff has. So yeah, this this is considered. I consider this ahead of its time. You know, although other bands had paved the way for that to be ahead of its time, and there of course I'm talking about the Pearl Jams, the Soundgardens, and the such. But let's rewind back again, and this was ahead of its time and paved the way for a lot of bands. I would say this album of the Ramones, the debut album. Yeah, it's ahead of its time when you can think about it and consider it where it came out and from listening to it and knowing that because I've heard this before, of course, way back when it's kind of first not when it first came out, but a little bit later on, of course, because I discovered this more in the '80s, mid '80s and that. And being turned on to this next group here, of course, and I would consider that when this came out, the quirkiness, the wackiness of it. Yeah, there was wacky stuff before, but I don't think anything was quite like Devo. I think this was slightly ahead of its time. Maybe not as much ahead of its time as others, but still just enough that I would put that in the category too. That this was ahead of its time. Are we not men? No, we are Devo. Yeah, well, yeah, we are Devo. Now, these next couple of things here I want to mention, and am I missing something here? Oh, yes, I am missing something. I kind of threw it right on top of there. I want to talk about these. Yeah, I'm only halfway done. I still got so much more to show. I'm just preparing here. Now, when it comes to what I personally consider to be ahead of its time and still maybe even unappreciated, I mean, yeah, there will be their fans, of course, and their fans will, and even if a band has a lot of fans, which these some of these do, and some of them have more fans now than ever before, but okay, we'll start for my very first album, which I still, even today, consider this still ahead of its time. And yeah, I'm talking about the Electric Lucifer by Bruce Hack. This album is so bizarre and so strange, and yet the more I hear it And recently, I had given this as a listen for Larry Graves on his Patreon, where he does full album reviews, and he appreciated it a lot more than I was expecting, you know. But no, it I think it's ahead of his time, and still kind of unappreciated. Same thing with this album by Voivod. I consider Voivod Nothing Face to be an like a under the radar, underrated album that is that for its time, I consider it ahead of its time. I remember when I first heard it, okay, I thought this was so advanced. This was so like, it something about it reminded me of Star Trek. Star Trek, futuristic, the melding of mind and machine, and it was like the perfect combination, the perfect representation of this whole, you know, and like Borgified type of personality of how human beings is being like it's incorporated with the mechanical. That's what that kind of represented for me. The lyrics, the music, the tone, you know. I always loved it. I always loved that, and I consider this, yeah, ahead of its time. All right, let's get to the last four bands that I want to talk about a little bit, maybe a little bit more in depth, because again, I think some of these bands here are well, I think all of these are ahead of this time, and especially these two albums. You can put a lot of the albums of this band in there, but I'm going to talk about King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard for a moment. I think there's for the new century, for this new century after the year 2000, this group came into play in 2012. 2012, and they have like 27, like 26, 27 albums out right now. They're so prolific, and these two being, I consider them ahead of its time. Again, like the Voivod and everything, this album, Nonagon Infinity, is my second favorite album of all time. I think this is so. I think this is so underrated. I think more people should really be turned on to this of how genius, and way ahead of its time that I don't think it's getting the appreciation that it deserves. Same thing with this very first microtonal album that they did. I consider this a way ahead of its time. What other band like this, okay, with this type of music is doing microtonal stuff like that? None that I know of. When I first heard about this, and this was the first album I heard of King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. It was, right from Rattlesnakes in the first track. I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is really ahead of its time, and yeah, and they have their fans, they have like their diehard fans, and I'm one of them now, but coming in late to the game, way late to the game. I've only been a fan of this for the last maybe 2 years, and they've been going since 2012. Yeah, so I consider them very ahead of the curve, definitely. Let's go back now into the early 70s, and let's okay, talking about Sparks for a moment. As much as that new album is awesome and it's like a perfection, the last couple of albums, the last well even last Girls Is Crying in Her Latte was special, but but Propaganda and Kimono My House, well, they go in that order, being Kimono My House first and then Propaganda, the first two for the Island Years. I don't have Indiscreet yet, but I desperately would love to get it. Of course, that's up there on my list of what I need to get for Sparks. But these were ahead of his time. I mean, they got the appreciation they wanted, but I don't think again they didn't really get the appreciation of how advanced and ahead of his time this was. And for that matter, and again, I don't have the second album, Woofer and Tweeter's Clothing, but I do have this as their first album. and you can hear, where. Now, I mean, now that I have really heard this with like real precision and trying to listen to it, this I would consider this also ahead of its time and underappreciated. I appreciate it so much more than that first when because when you're doing comparisons, when you're associating and making comparisons, because of these masterpieces in their own right, and then you go back and listen to this, I didn't really appreciate it those first couple of listens how ahead of its time it really is. So that's why this I want to mention that. Of course, I can't talk about this list of bands that are ahead of its time without mentioning my favorite band of all time. But before we get to that, so the second to last one, I have to mention, and I'm not even going to mention my first favorite band because they don't count. Were they ahead of their time also for putting on makeup and yeah, okay. Maybe Kiss were ahead of their time and still underappreciated, but they would. But you have to admit, as great as those songs, and I do love all those songs from the classic Kiss stuff, from like pretty much everything from the first decade of the makeup stuff. They were poppy commercial type of songs still at the same time. But when this next band became my second favorite band of all time at the time in the '80s, it's which of course it started with Master of Puppets. Yes, I'm talking about Metallica, and this would be ahead of its time, okay, in some rights, right? Not necessarily even going because I started with that, but going back and listening to the first two albums of Ride the Lightning and Kill 'Em All, okay, Kill 'Em All. Kill 'Em All was definitely ahead of its time. Uh, and this, of course, brought them up to, you know, but yeah, no one was doing this before Metallica. That type of thrash metal, that fury, and there are other bands that were getting close in that, and bands that came out after that really that perfected the formula, but they invented that formula, that thrash metal type of formula. And again, they were inspired by so many bands, like especially like Motorhead and Diamond Head and all those other kind of heads. so so they got ahead, but this here is ahead of its time, I will have to say. All right, let's go now to the for me my favorite band and the number one uh, group that was as ahead of its time. Now I will throw in this right away that my favorite album of all time, Lateralis, it was ahead of its time. It was mystical. It was so like it was everything I wanted it to be when this first came out. After being on you know, out of the public for 5 years, they had not made an album in like 5 years, and then boom, they made this perfection. That first year they came out, that very first year, I was in Montreal, and it is perfection. But yeah, this was ahead of its time. But of course, I have to go back to these, right? Now, it's an EP, okay? It's an EP. But when I first heard this just a simple EP, just before the year before this came out, this was perfection again for me. This was like I felt personally ahead of its time. It was way ahead of its time and so underappreciated. I'm glad people caught up on them eventually. It wasn't until this came out, and but then Anima, yeah, but 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 these two albums, I would put them on even footing because you can't have one without the other. They were a two for one deal when they made their record deal, that they could they could release this, but they had to make this to make this, you know. So these are always kind of linked in that way. So I consider them the most ahead of their time. I mean, equally everything else can be, equally as ahead of their time. But for me personally, this was the biggest game changer tool. All right, I am done. So if you have other albums in mind that you consider, you know, ahead of its time, let me know in the comments below because I love reading your comments. Of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do because I will love you, forever and greatly appreciate it. Be sure to don't be afraid to hit that like button, of course. And okay, I'm done for this one. I still have some cool ideas coming up this week and everything, and I'm going to try to change things up as much as humanly possible. But everybody, be safe, take care. I will see you on the flip side, and please, everybody, have a great day, evening, morning, night, or afternoon, wherever you may be. Peace, everybody.